Okay, I think we're ready to begin. So welcome everybody to the inaugural session of In the Process, a series of online artist interviews organized by AICA Southern Caribbean, a regional chapter of the International Art Critics Association. I'm Allison Thompson, and I am the president of AICA Southern Caribbean. These conversations, we hope, which are part of an outreach initiative by the members of AICA Southern Caribbean, will delve into the ideas and experiences of creative practitioners from the Caribbean, their art-making process, and the ongoing work of creating and communicating meaning. And it seems particularly fitting that we begin this series, this project of outreach, with Alberta Whittle. Alberta was born in Barbados and works between Barbados, Scotland, and South Africa. Informed by diasporic conversations, Alberta considers radical self-love and collective care key methods in battling anti-Blackness. Her practice involves choreographing interactive installations, using film, sculpture, and performance as site-specific artworks in public and private spaces. Whittle's recent solo exhibition, How Flexible Can We Make the Mouth, at Dundee Contemporary Art in Scotland, focused on healing, writing, and speech as a means of self-liberation. Alberta was one of 10 recipients of the 2020 Turner Bursaries, awarded this year in lieu of the Turner Prize nominations to artists, quote, chosen for their significant contributions to new developments in contemporary art, end quote. She was a Raw Material Fellow at Dakar in 2018 and the Margaret Tate Award winner for 2018-2019. Whittle is also the recipient of the 2020 Frieze Artist Award, and that film will premiere next month. She's a committee member at Transmission Gallery in Glasgow and a board member at SCAN, Scottish Creative Artwork. There are a number of exciting events coming up for Alberta, including participation in the Liverpool Biennial and the British Art Show 9, both in 2021. That is nothing short of phenomenal, Alberta, so congratulations. But I need to add that Alberta is the daughter of Janice Whittle, the curator at Queen's Park Gallery here in Barbados, and Nick Whittle, artist and writer, as well as a founding member of AICA Southern Caribbean and a former president of the chapter. So as I said at the beginning, it could not be more fitting that we begin our In the Process series with this very busy, very exciting artist. Alberta, thank you for taking the time to join me today in this conversation. I want to begin to say that even though we're here chatting online in this very kind of strange format, you're still here in Barbados, as am I. And curiously, we've not seen each other face to face before this since the opening of your solo exhibition, Business as Usual, at the Tyburn Gallery in May 2019, when I happened to be in London for the opening. I've really wanted to have an opportunity to sit down and chat to you about your work since then, but so much has happened, so much has changed. You came back to Barbados in March, just prior to the COVID-19 shutdown. It's been a crazy and unprecedented 6 months. In addition to the pandemic, we've been witnessing Black Lives Matter protests, the pulling down of monuments, the surreal situation in the US with the run-up to the presidential elections, the ongoing uncertainty of Brexit. And you have to feel blessed to be here in Barbados, where the country has done such an incredible job of managing this global crisis so far. And you're here to witness the recent breaking news that we're on track to become a republic. And the country now is going to recognize same-sex civil unions. And during all these unprecedented events, there have been a series of very exciting developments in your career: the Turner Bursary, the British Art Show, the Frieze Art Award, and somehow you have been able to continue working through all of this. So I'm wondering what this past 6 months has been like for you. We're not hearing you. Natalie?
Okay, I think
There
that's
we go,
pretty gone.
great.
You know, I really want to say thank you so much to you, Allison, and the rest of the AICA Southern Caribbean chapter, Natalie at the Barbados Museum, and all of your cohort there. I really appreciate this opportunity to come and share a little bit about my work and my process. But I agree, it's a really phenomenal time to think about one's blessings, especially with so much global change and hardship and grief that's surrounding the world. And I do feel incredibly lucky to be home. When I decided to come home, it was really with such a huge sense of uncertainty. I don't think any of us knew in March, April, what was going to happen, whether or not this was going to be a very quick instant of in time of the pandemic, or really whether or not it's going to be a much longer haul. And when the pandemic became the condition that became more and more clear, I really felt so grateful to have this time at home and really think about what it means to be based here for a prolonged period of time, and also what it means to be looking in and looking out. I had initially thought this was going to be a very, very quiet time for me. So much of my work had been postponed or cancelled, and I thought it was really going to be a much slower, more reflective time. But then, you know, when the scope of COVID became really much more clear, especially in terms of how it would impact Black people, people of color, migrant groups, and that there was a significant lack of preparedness for how to support these communities, I really felt very galvanized to think, to act, to make work. And two of the organizations I had been due to present work with, they rallied, and we decided to work towards a digital program, which was a very new way for me to work in terms of like thinking about just working in a digital realm, not working within a physical environment. And it gave me the opportunity to really reflect on what's happening globally, pertaining to ideas on power, race, geography, and precarity. So in April, I showed with Glasgow International with their online program, and I shared this new film work, Business as Usual, Hostile Environment. And then for Art Night London in June, they also went online. And so I prepared a film called Holding the Line, which has been made available for this talk. And these two films were really made in such quick succession, and with a really short turnaround because of the urgency of the times which we're living in. And with this desire, but also a really very strong sense of responsibility to reflect on what's happening in a very live way, to the social conditions of our time, to the political conditions of our time, and especially in relationship to the lack of support for the communities I've already mentioned, who are often working at the front line. So without the personal protective equipment, PPE, and you know, with the difficult conditions of frontline workers and the question around defunding the police, systemic violence and grief, I really wanted to reflect on what for me are the most volatile times I've ever experienced, and really try and almost grapple with what these times have really generated in terms of grief, in terms of loss, and really think about how as an artist I can be some kind of storyteller, but also create questions for my audience. So the time has been very, very rich, but also giving me a lot of kind of time and room to really think and reflect on these times.
As you mentioned, we've provided two films in the lead up to our chat. The first, August Come It Must, is a chapter from a larger film, Between a Whisper and a Cry, the making of which was facilitated by the Margaret Tate Prize. And this film was a central part of your solo exhibition, How Flexible Can We Make the Mouth, at Dundee Contemporary Arts, which opened a year ago in September 2019. And we're seeing some installation shots now from that exhibition. Can you tell us a bit about that show, both the scope, which was your most ambitious to date, as well as the focus or intention of the show? Because although people listening today are hopefully now familiar with your video work, this exhibition was really quite expansive in terms of the kinds of work it brought together.
This was such a beautiful invitation. And to be honest with you, when I was invited to have the show, I never imagined that I would have the whole gallery, and it's a really, really expansive, huge, cavernous space, and to have the opportunity to go in and play in that space and think about what is possible with more institutional support than I've had before. And also really key to that was also having access to the print studio, which is connected to the whole building and the institution, was just so incredible. And it meant that I could be more ambitious than I've ever been able to be before. And you know, it was a very, very special moment, and it's hard to imagine it's a year and not quite a week ago that it happened. And I'm still really sitting with many of the questions that came up in that work. And a main preoccupation in my practice is water, thinking about how it relates to ancestry, to globalization, to healing, and again, to grief and loss. And the work at the DCA, it became a way to discuss how the sea relates to all of this, but also how the sea becomes a witness to our times, to our history. And the exhibition begins with a suite of prints, which were made in collaboration with the DCA Print Studio. And these prints respond to original prints made in the 15th century by Theodore de Bry. And he made these woodcuts imagining the encounters between Columbus and indigenous people in the Americas. And when I approached these prints, it was really with the view to almost intervene with this narratives of arrival and welcome, and also who has the power to narrate these histories, who's valued in these stories, whose care is prioritized with that representation, and who ends up being valorized. And as an entry point into the exhibition, this suite of prints really begin to open up that conversation, which I'm hoping to bring the audience alongside with. But conversely, at the end of the exhibition, I end up making, there's a much smaller, almost like it's a much smaller room, and it's allowed for a greater intimacy. And in that room, I ended up making this film called From the Forest to the Concrete to the Forest. And that film was made on, I guess, a few days before the exhibition opened on the 13th of September, but it was used to respond to Hurricane Dorian that had hit the Bahamas on the 1st of September. So within the less than 2 weeks, I really felt called upon to, in some ways, reflect and respond to that moment, because the linchpin for the exhibition really is this film Between a Whisper and a Cry, which considers ideas connected to climate colonialism. And I was really very, very affected witnessing from a distance what was going on in the Bahamas and you know, to our neighbors in different islands, and thinking about that lingering devastation that is still present, and how, as an artist, I can't avoid that tragedy. And it's really important for me to also make sure that audiences also have to encounter that tragedy. And I wanted to find a way to work with this very immediate situation in the Bahamas, but I also wanted that the audience didn't see imagery that necessarily reproduced the trauma in seeing these images and testimonies from the news. It's very important to me that in the films I make and the work I make, that audiences do not end up being re-traumatized by seeing or experiencing something which is going to too closely cause them significant pain. I think it's very important to me that there are kind of different elements which can become more haunting, like voice, imagery, thinking about the landscape, and again to weather and people's experiences of that, but not to trigger audiences. And so I wanted to really very carefully control the environment, and because it was a small room, I was able to make this into a space where there was a greater allowance for intimacy. And so the work was presented on a large flat screen TV, and it was a very intimate, small seating area. But I worked very closely with two very good friends, Ama Josephine Budge and Fenella Gabriche, and again, the DCA Print Studio, to produce an installation where the audience could be held in some ways. So I ended up producing a quilt and a series of cushions, which create a kind of a very quiet space for looking at this work. And the ideas for the cushions and the quilts really came from Amma, because when she was commissioned to write a text for the publication, she asked me to draw a family tree. And this actually felt really quite emotional for me, because I think I'd always avoided formally thinking about family lineages. And as a descendant of slavery, I assumed, you know, most formal genealogical knowledge would be lost to me. And it felt like just opening that up would be very, very painful. And I wasn't sure if I could really even approach that. But with the help of my parents, my grandmother, and my sister, we managed to craft this family tree, which is this long, entangled document which shows the erasures and absences. And so that was printed onto one side of the quilt, and then the reverse of the quilt, I then brought this Adinkra symbol, Amma's from Ghana. And so it felt really nice to kind of also speak of these different transatlantic links with our conversations, but also geographically. And so I use this Adinkra symbol, which is, I'm probably mispronouncing it terribly, Ese Na Tikama. And this was stitched, embroidered onto the reverse, onto onto a different fabric. And this Adinkra symbol means the teeth and the tongue, which symbolizes friendship and interdependent relationships, which for me are really core to my working practice and my process. And so Fenella helped make the quilt, and then the cushions, which are also exhibited within that installation, were made using thermochromatic paint, and they were screen printed to mean that when a body was sitting on the cushions or maybe resting on the cushions while they were looking at the film, that trace, that presence would be visualized almost as a literal haunting. And it was really my hope when I was conceptualizing and designing the exhibition with the curator, Owen Dara, who's just an absolute darling, that, you know, there would be this idea of a journey and would allow for moments of rest, so that the audience would really be able to meaningfully think about these ideas of contestation and contested histories and their personal relationships to them.
That's beautiful. We're looking here at an installation shot from the show with the film Between a Whisper and a Cry, which looks at climate change, and in particular, the vulnerability of the Caribbean and other small island states. And for you, the actual setting, the installation, is very important in terms of how the viewer interacts with the film as a whole. Why was this important, and how did it contribute to an understanding of the video? And how do the conditions under which films are viewed, the environments that you create for them, which in many instances have very clear connections to the Caribbean, how do these function as a tool of communication, particularly in the UK with audiences that may not come from small island nations?
When I began making Between a Whisper and a Cry, it was almost a year before the BC exhibition, so it was, I'm always capturing footage, I'm always gathering and filming things wherever I am, but the intense period of editing probably began in August 2018, and that was within it was a particularly bad hurricane season, and I was really struck by the lack of empathy or concern that friends and colleagues in Europe felt about the approaching hurricane season. And, you know, most weekends I would speak to family or friends and they say, yep, we're preparing just in case a hurricane is going to hit us. And there was this expectation which really struck me as being incredibly naive and lacking in thought or really awareness about this expectation that rebuilding is possible and there are endless resources to rebuild. And that we as small island nations have the infrastructure to support constant devastation and these cycles of devastation. And then, you know, even when I would give examples of Hurricane Sandy or Katrina, I'd be met with, you know, this really kind of like almost emotional passivity to these ideas that, you know, we're at serious risk every time there's a hurricane season coming in. The lives can be lost. And so to kind of accentuate this emotional passivity and concern and this lack of understanding around the different power relationships, the environment, and how this relationship to climate colonialism is embedded within all of that, I wanted to bring in the architecture of our chapel houses to speak of endurance, thinking about rebuilding colonialism, beauty, and hope. And if you look at the back of the picture, you can see this sunken chapel house in the teal and the pink. And this was named for the Barbadian calypsonian Dennis Blackman, who's also known as the Great Peru. And I remember as a child hearing about how he died in sea, but at sea, in Allison, that his house had actually been washed away to sea, and he, not being able to swim, couldn't escape. And so he perished at sea, even though he was potentially could have been saved. And that memory of him and that loss, that really sat with me when I was making all of the work and conceptualizing the work. And that saying we have about the sea being in God's back door, that literally kept on coming to me as a phrase when I was making the work. And so for me, that house, it becomes a memorial for him, half washed away, its foundation sunken, and the accompanying installation, which is the screen, and you can see just the top of the galvanized and the bit of the fretwork referencing chapel houses. But I think maybe in the next picture, you can see a set of plastic stackable chairs, and they have heavy chains interlaced between the legs. And as a framing device for Between a Whisper and a Cry was developed from our Bajan poem, June Too Soon, July Stand By, August Come at My, September Remember, October All Over. And in the September section, which you can actually see, it's a lovely moment of synchronicity. This image of a still from the work in this installation, that was taken, that was filmed predominantly during a service with Mount Pigba's Spiritual Baptist congregation. And the stackable chairs reference the chairs found in the church gatherings. And the chains refer back to the collars, chains, and gagging devices that were used during slavery to render the enslaved chattel, but also collateral. And that idea of people being rendered collateral, really permeates so much of my work, especially now when we look at these frontline workers. They're all of these moments are really very connected, and I'm often quite surprised at how we don't. There's almost an ambivalence towards thinking about history, because I really feel it is consistently repeating. And so I wanted the audience to understand that even when they witness the film, and they are witnesses, the issues that are raised in the film, you can't escape thinking about power and how that relates to us today. If you sit on the chairs and you are vaguely aware of those chains, or if your foot touches those chains, they become a weight, a literal weight for the audience to sit with. And when I was gathering the chains, which came from a shipping merchant in Glasgow, I wanted their weight to be referential to the average weight of 2 adults and a small child. So roughly about 400 pounds, to allow for however that would permeate, depending on how light or heavy you are. But it's meant to permeate to a small family, and thinking about that loss, and how historically you would find, the chains and the bodies of the slaves becoming ballast on the slave ships, but also how bodies are thrown overboard, depending on how their value can be capitalized, when dead or alive, either sold on the auction block or recouped in insurance claims. And I think there's an interesting echo with that, with how we look at the migrant crisis, and so many people, again, losing their lives, being used temporarily as ballast, and then literally being thrown overboard if it doesn't make commercial sense for people who've been brought into that business of transporting people in that quest to find Europe, to access Europe. And so these intentional conceptual devices, they've become really significant for me in terms of how I make decisions to how to show the film. And the more recent films I've made since lockdown in March, Holding the Line, Business as Usual, Hostile Environment, I've really had to think about how to attend to the lack of control or support I can offer audiences when they view the work outside of physical environment, exhibition environments that I can control, or offer some kind of comfort. I'm now hyperly aware that people are watching the films on their phones, on their tablets, when they're chopping their food for dinner, when they're looking after a baby. There's no way in which you can't attend to everything, but it is at the back of my mind trying to think about how to nurture conversations when someone is on their own and they're trying to deal with them with so much going on around them. And so for my new Freeze film, Reset, I've really been thinking about this a lot, and I'm still really figuring that out in terms of what instructions to offer audiences, in terms of how they can engage with the work, because I do think we're now moving into different curatorial questions about audience and care, and what curatorial devices can be put in place with so much moving online and with these restrictions related to social distancing. Performances cannot be the same. Viewing work is no longer the same.
We've had a couple of comments about some problems hearing us volume-wise. So maybe if we both just kind of lean into our laptops and speak a little bit louder, that might help. And also, this is a shout out to Natalie. Somebody was suggesting, Natalie, that you and I should mute our mics while Alberta is talking, that might help as well. So we'll try that. And you can, in the chat room, let us know if we're doing a better job. That would be great. So the August chapter, which is the one that people were able to view, begins with a quote. And I think we have a slide of that, Natalie, if you can put that up, from Toni Morrison's Beloved. By and by, all trace is gone, and what is forgotten is not only the footprints, but the water too, and what is down there. The rest is weather, just weather. And this quote, which you told me doesn't, although you read it, it doesn't actually appear as text in the final version. But the quote, I think, really contextualizes the many different types of images and film clips that are presented in this chapter. And in particular, you draw a connection between Morrison's discussion of weather as it relates to the history of slavery, and how that was taken up by Christina Sharp to speak about anti-Blackness as climate today. And very directly link those conversations to images of the Caribbean landscape and climate change. So this layering of images, both archival and your own footage, and text through the readings of Morrison and Sharp and also Kamau-Brathwaite, enables a visualizing of this ongoingness, as Sharp would say, of the impact of colonialism on the Caribbean landscape. Can you talk about how you try to manifest this relationship in this work?
You know, I really love that idea of ongoingness. I find it incredibly useful to think about these conversations that have never stopped, in a way. And I think it's a really useful anchor. I think when we're looking at these ideas of history and connecting them to the globalized precarity that we're in right now. And the Toni Morrison quote came to me through Christina Sharp's incredible text In the Wake and on Blackness and Being, and her insights alongside Kamau-Brathwaite's scholarships have impacted so much of my thinking. And you know, so this is a really interesting image to bring up, where I'm actually in Dakar, and I'm on this very precarious, very small boat, and I'm trying to limbo. And I found how Kamau-Brathwaite, but also Wilson Harris, speak of the phantom limb and the limbo as being these different strategies to maneuver, but also how they speak of dislocation and a severing of community. And there's something in that severing, in that limbo, in that dance, which crops up by much better dancers and performers in that chapter, and how we try and grapple with loss. And, you know, I decided to use this quote directly from Toni Morrison because of how she emphasizes relationships between the everydayness of anti-Blackness and the everydayness of dealing with these histories and that idea of ongoingness, but also how we're haunted by that. You know, whether we bring it back to Christina Sharp's ideas of the weather, we're haunted by that climate. It is inescapable. And this idea of fragility and of memory really makes me pause and think about what is forgotten, how we can challenge memory and history as artists, but also what does it mean when we forget and grief cannot be registered and grief cannot be attended to, and then healing is somehow diminished. And that scope and hope and desire for healing, as well as trying to figure out what this grief means, it sits very heavily with me. And I was very lucky that both Christina Sharp was able to write something for my catalog for the DCA show, but also, you know, Kamau, he allowed me to also have the Kumina poem, which is also about loss and grief within as a centerpiece for the publication. And it really becomes, the whole show in a way is a bit of a dedication to working through loss and grief. And I think that there's something about these global connections into loss and the possibility for these transnational, intergenerational conversations between these writers like Kamau, Wilson Harris, Toni Morrison, Christina Sharp, that really suggests all of these different geographies, from the Caribbean landscape to the landscape in the Highlands, where parts of Scottish Highlands, where part of the film is filmed, and this idea again of the limbo and of maneuvering and constantly being in these in-between spaces and thinking about these lines of connection and what is sometimes lost in those in-between spaces. So, you know, now that we're in September, coming to the close of the hurricane season, I'm still stuck there. I'm still stuck in that moment of ongoingness. You know, what is lying beneath the sea? What histories are still lying underneath the sea? And I think this is going to be an ongoing preoccupation that is going to haunt me forever in all of my work. It keeps on popping up whether I want it to or not. There's a limbo. I can't hear you.
Great. Now we should be good. I'm going to stop doing that. You've described your work as being research-based and your desire also to respond to current social issues and plights. And this is certainly very, very evident in the second film that we made available called Holding the Line, which was completed during your time here in Barbados. And it focuses on scenes of the police stopping and harassing Black men, protests in the street following the death of George Floyd, the pulling down of statues. And these are then contrasted with scenes of ritual and peacefulness and even joy. And here these scenes are brought into dialogue with one another through the definition of wayward by Saidiya Hartman, which is defined as the everyday struggle to live free. How was this film shaped by the experience of being in Barbados during this time of this great, profound global upheaval?
You know, I'm really grateful I was able to consider these ideas and witness from home. I often think about the idea of working from the periphery. In the UK, Scotland is considered at the periphery. Barbados is definitely considered at the periphery. The Caribbean is often considered at the periphery and not centered as it should be. And I think that by making this film here, it made me really think about how we understand history and this kind of cyclical ongoingness of these conversations, as well as movements of rebellions, of protests, and also of my own witnessing within these movements, because I was here for the Black Lives Matter protests, I was here for the protests against Nelson, and I was also here. One of the things I thought was really interesting when I was on the Black Lives Matter march was actually when this elderly woman spoke to the protesters and she said, "Why are you marching for something happening in the US?" And I thought, that woman is asking one of the most important questions I've heard in a while. And I often think about that, you know, if something like this happened here, and I think in some ways that we do really have to look at police violence, and it is something that does not come up often in Barbados. I doubt anyone in the UK would be marching for us. I doubt anyone anywhere else, possibly in the Caribbean, would be marching for us. But it was around the time I found myself, when I was marching, thinking about these historical rebellions and about how those rebellions in plantation yards, in the streets, on, you know, probably aboard ships, on the water, led to emancipation, and they changed capitalism and power forever. You know, I think not Christina Sharp, Sadia Hartman, you know, she often speaks about the non-event of emancipation, how that did not lead to freedom. And I think that's a really interesting idea to think about. What is freedom? And, you know, I grew up going to marches with my parents when the 8% cuts happened with, you know, to public workers. And that idea of social responsibility, but also almost a social contract and how we are responsible for each other. That occupies a lot of my mind. You know, it occupies a hell of a lot of headspace with me. And I almost want to offer that to my audiences, to think, okay, we're here in this social contract. How passive can you remain? How passive can you remain when you know, now you know, what are you going to do? And when I was making this film, I was really tired. I was really, really tired. And I thought about exhaustion and how, you know, after witnessing all of the deaths that happened during COVID, and then suddenly this moment with George Floyd, also a murder of a black man in England, you know, Simeon Francis, none of that was in the police, none of that was in the press, sorry. And I thought about this, you know, how endurance causes this literal weathering of people. And my dad had shared an article with me on this term weathering and how it relates to Black life and Black health, which states that epigenetic trauma or inherited trauma of living through systemic racism affects the life expectancy of Black people. And this idea of literal weathering of health and life returns me again to Christina Sharp and to Toni Morrison. And so the way in which Sadia Hartman and her scholarship on the wayward suggests this lens to consider refusal and rejection, I'm really, really interested in that, and how she thinks about fugitivity, but also how that fugitivity can create spaces of congregation and love and healing, and how that can be made possible. You know, that's a really important kind of calling point for me when I was researching this work. And there was this phrase which came about, which I think you quoted, the everyday right to live free. And that line hit me like a slap, and it made me start thinking so much about freedom. What does it mean to be free? Can we take freedom for granted, especially when there's so much violence? And I filmed my nephew, this image is of my nephew, when he was probably, I don't know, it's a few years ago, he was probably about 7. And I thought about him in this part of the film. He's literally dancing with the water. It's this beautiful moment of innocence that he's exhibiting, where he's in his own power. His freedom is precious, and it's palpable in this moment. And, you know, in a way, this film really tries to find some hope, that hope for that freedom that can be achieved through refusal and maybe through betrayal of the state, and finding new ways of instituting otherwise. I think, you know, this is a very important point in our history to really think about what freedom looks like and what it can be, and what is our relationship to that. You know, this image here was filmed when I was in Brazil, and it was during a carnival, and the police were literally chasing everyone who was at this carnival. The police presence was so strong, you couldn't separate that idea of liberation and joy from the police. The two were so inextricably tied, and that freedom that is being performed in carnival is still under the surveillance of the police. And it really kind of sat with me quite a lot, but also trying to think about healing and how healing can be constituted alongside freedom.
I have two more questions for you, and then we will open it up for people. So if they want to post some questions for you in the chat room, they should feel free to do that. So we are both, I think, big fans of the artist Sonia Boyce. When we last spoke a month ago, I asked who were the important influences for you? And you mentioned, of course, your parents and the experience of growing up in a household of artists and curators and writers. But you also mentioned Sonia, and you reminded me that you were present when we brought Sonia to Barbados over a decade ago to conduct some workshops with students at the community college and the wider art community. And right now, you happen to be in an exhibition in Birmingham, and we're looking at it right now. It was up before COVID and shut down and now has reopened. And it's called In the Castle of My Skin, an homage, of course, to George Lamming. And there you're showing two works, the film Between a Whisper and a Cry and the Limbo piece. And when I first posed this question to you about influence, I was actually thinking about Sonia. It was a leading question because it's so clear that you both share this fascination with collaborative performance, the importance of collaboration, and that importance of connecting with the audience. So I wanted to ask, you've spoken a little bit about it, but I wanted you to talk a little bit more about collaboration as a working method and how all of that is impacted now with this new emphasis on social distancing.
Good question with how it's going to relate to social distancing. I have to think about that. You know, I have a wonderful memory of when I met Sonia at that talk, and I had this lovely opportunity to share a little bit about my work with her. And, you know, I remember her saying to me, what does it mean working on all of these different mediums? Because I work in a lot of different mediums. I did then as well. And I didn't really, and she said, you know, do a lot of people push back against that and try and pigeonhole you into doing one thing? And I said, yes, they do. And she said, you know, you must just ignore that. And when you feel called to do something, you must do it. And she spoke about how she had worked with different people in her different video works and also with her research. And I found that very, very helpful. And I saw her work in Venice, the work she'd done with Elaine Michener in the Arsenale. And I really love that work with Elaine. It's one of my favorites. And, you know, with regards to collaboration, I do admire how she really brings people on board with her different research projects. I think that's a really amazing gift to do that. And for me, collaboration, I think, it really became fundamental to my thinking and my practice when I became a committee member at Transmission, because, you know, we were all of these individual artists, curators, researchers who came together as a collective and all at different stages to think about how to contend with art making under the times which were huge funding cuts, huge calls to decolonize, what it meant for our committee, which was this new committee who were focusing more on looking at the erasures or exclusions of marginalized groups in Scotland. And it was really interesting to me how collaboration could become this dreaming space, actually, this dreaming, wayward space to think about friendships as accomplices, which David Scott says. And I thought that's just a wonderful notion to really develop these relationships with people, which is based on sharing and non-hierarchical learning together and bringing people alongside with you. And so the experience of working at Transmission, it really grounded so much of how I work now and with different people and different organizations, where, you know, my power as being someone who is orchestrating some of these things really is checked often and regularly with people who I'm working with. And they do ask questions of me, and they'll be the people to come and poke me, but also to kind of make sure that I try and also create space for people to have their own agency to dream and think about, you know, their ideas in relationship to what I'm looking at. And that's a real gift, but it's also something which I think is important in terms of how it can keep you humble as an artist and really keep you focused on continuously learning. One of the groups who I've been collaborating with under this project with Glasgow Sculpture Studios and Glasgow International is Mary Hill Integration Network, and they're a community-led organization working with people going through the asylum seeker process, but also with migrant communities. And we've been working with the Joyous Choir, which is one of their initiatives and groups, and they have taught me so much about protest through joy and song as being a way to liberate oneself, and song and voice as being something to heal through. And I think about that all the time. I really, really think about that all the time, and about the capacity to hold on to hope when you're in a really precarious situation. And fortunately, through this collaboration, we've been collaborating together on and off for probably, I think, since 2016, with a project I did with my very wonderful long-term collaborator, Denise Ooster. And I think it's one of the best things I've ever brought into my practice, is this idea of collaboration. And with regards to social distancing, it's actually really interesting because the Freeze film has almost entirely been done with collaborators, some of which I know and some new ones, but from Barbados, where all of the filming and making, apart from things that have been happening at home, has happened from a distance because of borders being shut and different restrictions. So that's been a new point of collaboration, which I've really enjoyed because it really makes you trust and have hope. So I would say this new film, Reset, is really grounded in hope. It is a gesture of hope.
That relates to my last question for you. So you've been selected as one of the artists to be included in the British Art Show 9 in 2021. And the curators have explained that the artists who were selected for that exhibition respond in critical ways to this precarious moment in Britain's history that, quote, has brought politics, narratives of identity, and questioning of agency to the center of public consciousness, both by exploring new modes of resistance and imagining more hopeful futures. So your representation of the British experience is almost always in reference to the diaspora, the experience of migration, the history of colonialism, and the traumatic effects that imperial past has had on the Caribbean region and on people of color. So I'm wondering, are you hopeful about the future or futures? And what modes of resistance do you employ to forge your way towards those more hopeful futures?
That's a really good question. You know, I'd really say a lot of this lies with self-compassion. I mean, I think I've lived in the UK on and off for a long time now. And when I think about Britain, and by extension, I guess my own Britishness, it's definitely from the perspective of a migrant. My perspective can't help but be informed by looking across at Barbados, but also looking back at Britain. And in terms of hope, I think if I wasn't hopeful, I wouldn't bother making work anymore. And whilst I've been looking so much at scholarship by Afro-pessimists like Saidiya Hartman or Fred Wilderson, I really also think a lot about bell hooks and how she creates this space for learning and thinking about hope. And I like to think that art is such an intimate thing. It really encourages audiences to think about their own relationship to experience, objects, things, images, hopefully from the heart. And with the work which I'm developing for British Art Show, you know, I'm very excited about the fact that it's going to happen in different spaces. And each of those spaces, each of those locations brings, well, it suggests a particular specificity to that context, but it also means that the conversations will shift and grow. And so the work I'm hoping to do will also mutate and grow, and certain things will maybe be, they might actually fall away. You know, they might not be in all of the, you know, the kind of moving installation. And it feels like a gesture of hope to keep on making these works. And I think it's a great invitation to, from Irene and Hamad to actually offer opportunities to consider these difficult histories in cities in the UK, where sometimes these conversations are not at the forefront. Mm-hmm. So I'm very excited about this new development in my research and thinking about what will happen next. Because one of the venues, Plymouth, that is a really interesting space in terms of colonialism and how you could consider that in terms of the UK and the Americas, one of the key spots of colonialism, of expansionism, of the migrant experience, especially reflecting on where we are now and it being 400 years since those pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. So it's going to be a very interesting adventure.
Okay, so we have about another 10 or 15 minutes. So if people would like to post some questions, we have a comment here from Annie Paul, who just says that the previous slide, the tree reaching out, is very cool. And I'll just point out that this image is from Reset, yes, which is the work. Everybody's kind of getting a bit of a preview here. This is the film that is being produced as part of your Frieze Art Award and will be premiered to the public next month.
Yes.
Can you tell us anything about it?
I can tell you a few little things about it. I'm really glad you like this image. This comes from one of my long-term collaborators. So I'm very lucky to have family who are invested in arts and supportive of my art career. And, my dad actually filmed this for me quite early on in receiving the invitation. And it was filmed not far from my house in Christchurch, in this grove where these women's tongue plants had been burnt down. And when I was looking at that space, I found myself thinking so much about, again, these images which I'm seeing globally of businesses being burnt down, of rebellion, and what it means, to geographically try and reach these conversations or kind of engage with these histories from the past. And this the original title was actually relating to this idea that I mentioned earlier, that when Wilson Harris and Kamal Brathwaite mentioned of the phantom limb and of severing of these limbs. And this my arm out, reaching out, is meant to kind of speak of that. It's meant to be this, I guess, kind of gesture in looking forward and looking back in this state of confusion, this state of precarity, of violence, but also with some elements of hope. And so Reset, as the title suggests, it tries to encourage almost a holistic resetting of where we are right now. And so it forms in some ways a bit of an uneasy trilogy with the two films I mentioned before, but it does stand on its own. And it becomes a space to reflect on what this cool spring and summer have meant. I was very lucky that I had several partners who were able to give me location support. So this is filmed at a beautiful building in a beautiful kind of sculpture park in Scotland called Jupiter Artland. And this is a very interesting building that was owned by a tobacco merchant, a plantation owner, but it's also a space with a really interesting ley line. So it also does suggest these kind of ancient spiritual practices. And this dancer, Mele Brooms, is actually half Asian, but grew up in the UK. And interesting, it was a very Caribbean crew who were working on the film with me. So that was also very nice. And she becomes this figure who really kind of holds these moments of resistance and refusal. And so this final potential ending of the trilogy, or pause within that trilogy, the film's really meant to suggest this reflection. It's much slower than some of the earlier works I've made. It's trying to attend to that difficult situation where I can't care for my audiences in the same way I normally would by producing a physical exhibition environment for them. So it invites the viewer onto this journey with me and tries to somehow take care of them whilst we deal collectively with this very difficult moment of ongoing violence and anticipatory hope and real grief as well. So it's there's a lot going on in this film, a lot going on.
Natalie, I don't know if there are questions on the Facebook feed. If there are, maybe you could put them into the chat for us. But in the meantime, I'll ask, I've got more questions, so I'll ask another question. There was this great interview with you in Studio International recently. And it starts with there is a question, but I'm going to continue mine. It starts with this great quote where you're saying, you know, everybody knows where the UK is, but nobody knows where Barbados is. And that neglect or that kind of blinder really fuels a lot of your work. And yet, you know, I've seen people posting pictures of newspapers all over the world now with this notice that Barbados is going to withdraw or is going to become a republic. And even with the announcement that, you know, we were offering these year-long visas. And there does seem to have been this newfound visibility for this place that at times, you know, people can't find on a map. I'm just wondering, you know, how you kind of navigate, and maybe that's us, maybe that's just you know, this blip in this moment. But the way in which, you know, here there is this sense of sort of adamant visibility, and that maybe once you leave the region, that is not the case.
I think, you know, I really agree with you. I think there has been much more of a gaze towards Barbados, especially with that visa program. I mean, so many people were saying to me, hang on a sec, I could come and live in Barbados. This will just be fantastic. And of course it would be. You know, Barbados is an amazing place to be from and to live. But I'm interested at how the conversations around Barbados and its scope and its place in the world stage are potentially changing. I think that we are in a very interesting moment, especially around the new legislation regarding same-sex marriage, around becoming a republic. This brings a lot of conversations, potentially some really overdue, in terms of what sovereignship looks like, around how we still understand power. And I'm very curious to see what this means. I mean, I'm sure it will find its way into other works as well, other future works too, especially with the gaze turning towards Barbados, because in earlier works, especially in relationship to the situation where we saw people from the Windrush generation being deported, I used a lot of imagery, you know, very stereotypical imagery that people would anticipate of fun and frolics in the Caribbean. So now that this idea or image of the Caribbean is changing, I'm very curious to see what seeds that brings, you know, and how the conversation will hopefully change in terms of the scope of the region and also the creative work that is happening here. And I think it's, you know, for a long time, we've been very limited by these narratives of history and by who gets to tell our stories. So I'm watching and waiting with great interest as well.
We have a question here from Abby Bainbridge. How long has weather been a theme in your work, and how do you source your imagery?
Well, that's a good question. Hi, Abby. I've been thinking, as I mentioned, when I was developing Between a Whisper and a Cry, I had been really almost struck dumb by the neglect of care towards the Caribbean and the Americas in the hurricane season. And I think it's that passivity and reluctance to really think about what has contributed to this situation of climate colonialism, where in these former colonial territories, we're now at the front line of devastation, to hurricanes, to landslides, to tsunamis all around the world. And I guess probably it's only been the last couple of years, but definitely since 2018. And a lot of the imagery I find I watch a lot of films, so I'm influenced by a lot of different people. I've always been obsessed with film, but also paintings and photography from around you know, from around the region as well. And I think often when I go into different spaces, it maybe makes me even more curious to think about what images are there. When I made Between a Whisper and a Cry, I had been thinking a lot about zombies and zombies in relationship to labor and capitalism. So there's a part of the August chapter where you see I walked with a zombie, and some of the footage was taken from that. And I really appreciate how Arthur Jaffa uses these different ways of collaging free source images. And, you know, I think that it's a very interesting way of connecting with these ideas. And collage for me as a tool, you know, I think it's a very Caribbean way of working. I've always worked in collage since I was a child, and I think it reflects to, you know, how we think about assemblage and how we think about carnival and building costumes and masquerades. So these are ideas which are always permeating my work. I'm going to go on to the next question.
Sure. So this one, although it says it's from Jariah Walcott, I think this is from Jessica. There's a lot of Jariah. It says, do you draw any connection between your thinking around climate and weather through the text of Sharp and Morrison and your interrogation of the hostile environment in Britain?
Yes, absolutely. I think the hostile environment, you know, by another name, is essentially the afterlife of slavery, and it is absolutely the weather. And you know, I started really looking at this work and at the themes of anti-Blackness when I'd been in South Africa on a residency, and I think I came back just as the hostile environments, legislations and systems of control were being implemented to mean that, you know, people from the Windrush generation's papers were destroyed. Landlords were being encouraged to inform on their tenants. Doctors were then informed to give information on their patients to the Home Office, to then encourage people being deported or detained in essentially prisons. And there's a huge correlation between how Sharp and Morrison speak about this overwhelming ongoingness of this climate of anti-Blackness that surrounds us. So for me, there's a really clear lineage, and I appreciate that link a lot.
Anissa Wood asks, she says she's really enjoyed the talk so far. What are the influences behind choice of dress, costume for performance, and even video work? For example, in the film Between a Whisper and a Cry.
So I think the main image you can see from that is the image of a dancer wearing what looks like a sailor's costume. So I'll give you a little background on the scene. So in the image which you see of, in fact, no, maybe in the August, it's actually more, August is more me. So I'm trying to kind of just remember which images you're seeing. So the one, I can see this one about to come up on the PowerPoint. So when you see me on the boat, I have been thinking, and I'm wearing leopard print and I have the cowrie shells. I've been thinking around different spiritual connotations to costume, and the leopard print is something which you see a lot in Southern Africa when you're going into certain spiritual places of retreat. And the cowrie shells, again, you'll know, you may know, they also are a very strong image connecting the Caribbean and the Americas to West Africa, where cowrie shells were, they were a symbol of money, they were a form of currency. And I often think about these different symbols and suggestions to create a particular aesthetic. And in Reset, I worked very closely with, again, a Caribbean designer based in Scotland, Sabrina Henry, who's from Nevis, and she also does a lot of research around these different spiritual and cultural practices. And so she developed the costume for Mele. She developed all of the costumes in the film, again, relating to different forms of knowledge, different healing practices. But for Between a Whisper and a Cry, there's also two stills, one of which will show a dancer wearing what looks like a sailor's outfit. And this is, unfortunately, you don't have access to that right now, but this was actually filmed in a place called, it was the Clydeport offices, and Clydeport is a shipping conglomerate, a very old shipping conglomerate, and this is their headquarters in Glasgow, this very richly paneled, mahogany paneled room. And Divine, who's the dancer here, I thought a lot about the sailors, the costumes of the sailors in Trinidad Carnival, and them being, I wanted Divine to suggest almost this kind of like if a sailor from the Caribbean found themselves in Scotland and how they would become, how they could potentially be this person refusing, and how she could perform through refusal in her actions in this space, because it's an earlier section which I'm afraid is not available, but she really dominates the scene and she becomes larger than life. So costume is incredibly important, whether or not I physically make the costumes or whether I get someone else involved to make them. They're really, really important. The sculpture matrix moves, which is the limbo figure, which is, I'm not sure where it is, that actually had another life as a costume, which I wore for a performance in Montreal. It's the one.
Natalie, you just buy it.
So that one was actually a costume. And then I wanted to repurpose it to give it another life. And that was looking at different ideas of masculinity related to masquerade traditions that ended up finding a whole new life. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Yeah, you said a lot of things that I had been wondering myself, so I was very glad to get that answer. So Annie Paul has another comment here. She is suggesting that you might want to read Diana Macaulay's latest novel, Daylight Come, which is also weather-driven, so to speak, she says.
Thank you so much for that recommendation, Annie. I do not know that book or Diana Macaulay, so I will definitely make a note of that right now.
So I think that brings us to the end of our discussion. We've answered all of the questions. I want to thank you, Alberta, for joining us today. This was really just such a wonderful chance to see more of your work and hear more about it and catch up with what your time has been like. And really, really, really wonderful. And just want to remind everybody that they need to keep a lookout for Reset, which I think is going to be made available online by Freeze.
Yes.
After the premiere in London. So we really look forward to seeing what's going to happen. You said you're heading back up next week.
Yes.
And so we look forward to see what happens with the rest of this year and your very busy 2021. So thank you. Before everybody leaves, Natalie, can we just show the last two slides? I just wanted to make a quick reference to two more events coming up. Our second in the process event will happen on Saturday, October 17th, again starting at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that is Steve Boras in conversation with Dominique Brebillon. And then also tomorrow, if you happen to be in Martinique, a number of members of AICA Southern Caribbean in Martinique are launching a new artists conversation with critics. And the first one will happen at the Habitation Clément, and it will feature the work of Hervé Buz. And that information is available on the AICA Southern Caribbean website. Please go and visit our Facebook page, and you'll get all of the information there. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you again, Alberta, and we hope to see you again in October. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, thank you so much.